The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the host of webinar. My name is Karen Mann, and I have with me my team, Sedita, co-chair webinar, and Brooks, division chair. We represent Human Development and Leadership Division of American Society for Quality. This is a global division aiming to enrich the personal and professional lives of our members and non-members, the global community, to trump over current and future challenges. We continuously look for new speakers within the range of our body of knowledge, which can be found in our website. We host monthly webinars. If you are interested or you know someone who is interested, we would be happy to review the application. The Book of Knowledge can be found on our website, www.asqhdnl.org. Link is also shared on the chat box on the very right side. Before we begin the webinar, let me go over the housekeeping and some webinar rules. If there is any question, please type under question section and we will answer the questions. You are allowed to send those questions during the webinar and we would happily answer them whenever we have an opportunity. Webinar will be held for 45 minutes and then question answers again will be held in the very end for 15 minutes. If you want continuous education credit 0.1 CEU, you have to be on the webinar for at least 40 minutes. You will receive a dedicated email from us, which you can save as PDF and send it to ASQ to claim your credit. Let me introduce to our speaker, Dunoon. Don is an independent leadership and organizational development specialist. Don has over 20 years consulting experience based in Sydney, Australia. He has worked with clients and colleagues internationally. He's the author of Leadership Mode, a book from Frame's Leadership and Management as developed forms of intervention in dealing with tough challenges. His writings and materials, including an article with acclaimed Harvard mindful researcher Dr. Alan Langer, have been used in leadership-related courses at several leading U.S. universities. A workshop on Don's OBREAU Tripod structure for supporting conversations that matter was awarded Outstanding Educator workshop at the 2016 conference of the Association of Leadership Educators in Sacramento, California. Don is presenting a workshop at WCQI 2018 in Seattle, and Dr. Richard Van Diol, T13, Enabling Conversations for Quality with the OBREAU Tripod. Don, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you to Sedita and Brooks. So it's a real honor and a pleasure to be presenting this webinar for ASQ HD&L division. I'm a passionate person when it comes to human development and leadership. This has been my area for 25 years or so, and I guess I'm really keen on the idea that we need to get beyond the technical. I mean, quality is a fascinating field, a very rich field, but so much of it is technical. We need to think about the human dimension and how we interact as people with a shared or varying interests in quality. So doing that implies conversation, and that's really the subject for us today. We'll be using this structure, the OBREAU Tripod. We'll talk about that as we go. I won't even pause to describe it now. What I'm going to do is, we'll begin just by charting the learning objectives for this session. So what I'm hoping is that through the session, you'll gain a sense of some default practices that tend to get in the way of conversation. Some practices we kind of automatically go to without even perhaps being aware of, and that are really quite pervasive, I think, in most organizations. And once we understand those, we've got a better chance of moderating their impact. We'll talk about the OBREAU Tripod, the structure, what it means, how you can use it, and we'll go into some specific guidance on how you can apply the tripod in approaching conversations on tough issues. And let me just flag, I was delighted to present on the tripod recently with Richard Van Dole, my collaborator at ASQ Seattle. That was a great session. People seemed to really get engaged with the tool. And I'm hopeful that we can develop a bit of a community of practice, a whole bunch of people using this in various different arenas to do with quality, and that, you know, it's available under Creative Commons so that, you know, people kind of get out there and apply it and learn from one another in putting it to use. Okay, so let's begin by talking about these default behaviors. Now, the first one is reacting. I guess most of you will have a sense of reacting as a pretty common default. You know, it's when people say things like, "Oh, I know what the problem is. That's obvious. You know, what we need to do is such and such. You know, this is the priority now." Or, "Oh, that's a stupid thing to say. That's a silly suggestion." You know, it's kind of in an immediate response that comes from largely an emotional place. It tends to be grounded in certainty, coming from the work of Ellen Langer. It's that we want to keep things simple. We want to, and also another influence for me is Chris Argyris, who was a long-time professor at Harvard University, and he talks about a whole lot of behaviours around being in control, being rational, saving face, competing with others, and this is the sort of bedrock on which I've framed these default behaviours. So reacting is the first one. The second one is judging, and that's the idea that when things aren't going in the way we'd like, we tend to apportion blame or responsibility to others. We tend to say, "Oh, you know, these people are self-interested," or "they like things just the way they are. They're not really up for change," or "they don't care about the organisation. They're only concerned about their own particular patch." Now, judging is another way of staying in control, simplifying the world, exporting responsibility, removing ourselves from having to take ownership to how we show up in dealing with issues. It's quite pervasive as well. The third one is dancing around. This is where we stop short of saying what we might like to say, because we're driven more by how we think will be received rather than what we truly want to say. So it tends to be, you know, responses like, "I wouldn't be heard on that," or "I couldn't say this," or "I've got to dilute this," or, you know, so we water things down, we sweeten them, we emphasize the positive, even if, you know, we say things are fine when we think they're not. Or we just suppress stuff. We just don't speak up when otherwise we might, even when we've got relevant expertise. And my proposition is that these three defaults actually work together, and they can work fairly closely. They reinforce one another. They can happen in the space of a couple of minutes. I recall recently speaking with a medical doctor who was chairing a committee talking about a new process. One fairly dominant member of the committee kept speaking up to return to a technical point. So when the speaker steps in again, the doctor reacts, thinks, "Here we go again. This person's trying to dominate the room." So she doesn't declare any of that. All she says is, "We need to move on to the next item. You know, we're running short of time." And at no point does she actually declare any of what she's sort of thought or processed. So the interjector is left none the wiser as to how their input was creating a problem. So I think we can do better than that, and that's the proposition that we're going to be talking about today. So we're trying to shift towards more mindful conversations, really to counteract the reacting thing. It's about slowing down, inserting a pause, just noticing, being open to possibilities, rather than defaulting to autopilot sort of, automatic emotional responses. It's slowing down that little, creating a bit of headspace just to see stuff, just to think what's actually coming up here and to respond. Instead of judging others, we're adopting a stance of curiosity, of appreciation, of recognizing that if others have got a way of seeing, might not be our way of seeing, we might not even understand it, but the more we can be just that little bit curious, like the two animals in the picture, we might learn something about what others are on about. And another element of this mindful approach is that we're aware that when we show up in dealing with an issue, we're bringing our own mental stuff as well, our assumptions, our beliefs, our thoughts and feelings. There's a whole lot going on for us. And the more we can mindfully just tune into that, to just take that bit of a deep dive, center a little and think, what matters to me here? What am I assuming? What am I bringing here? The more we can do that, the better the conversation is likely to go. And so we come to the tripod, the three legs of the tripod, the first one working from observation. We'll go through these in a little detail, but it's the idea of thinking about what can be seen directly as far as possible. That's not an interpretation. We're trying to kind of peel things back, get to the raw data, as it were. Secondly, attributing reasonableness. This is contemplating what it might look like to others, allowing they can be reasonable at this time. And even if we think, it seems unreasonable to us, let's allow it makes sense to them. It looks reasonable from their standpoint, and our challenge is to try and figure out what that is. And then the authenticity piece is taking that deep dive, thinking about what matters to us, and trying to put that into words as best we can. Now, it's never an all or nothing thing. It's about leaning in and trying to be as authentic as we can in this situation, in this moment. It's not about taking career-limiting moves. It's not about trying to be the fully authentic person. It's thinking right now, how can I move as closely as possible towards a truly, a true position for me. This notion of the little weather station on the tripod is a bit of a reminder that the three legs of the OBREAU tripod are mutually reinforcing, like any tripod. You kick out one of the legs and the weather station falls over. It's the same with the OBREAU tripod. If you don't have all legs in place, then you run the risk of a conversation that has not a great outcome. So you've got to consciously stay with each of those legs. That's a very important piece of the work. Now, I'm wondering, before we go into detail on working from observation, can I just check in with Sudhita and Kieran? Have we got any questions at the moment? Or perhaps people would like to text in or type in a question. Let's get a bit of interaction going. So if there are any questions, we can respond to those. If not, we'll keep going.
Yeah, Don, you can continue. I don't have anything at this moment.
Okay, good then. Thanks for that. Let's, just as a reminder to people, you can shoot the questions in, and let's kind of make it interactive. Let's make it more of a conversation, as it were. Okay, so the working from observation leg. Let's just think about the purpose here. The third dot point on the slide. What we're really trying to do is allow. It's really working from possibility. And Ellen Langer at Harvard, who was mentioned before, she talks about the psychology of possibility. Just having that window slightly open, just allowing that, there are different ways of interpreting any kind of observable. Now, there are lots of things we can notice in any situation. So it's being a little attentive, thinking about, as it were, what are the gold nuggets here? What really stands out? Trying to get beyond the interpretations, and we'll go into some examples in a minute to make this a little clearer. But we're trying to, as it were, come up with things we notice, and often they're about gaps. So, for example, It might be that, well, an interpretation might be there's a poor quality of compliance around this process. Well, that may be true, but let's actually go to the data. So the standard says X ought to be happening, but what we can see is the process, the process being used is Y. There is a gap between the two. And often with observations, it's looking to those gaps. The performance agreement says one thing, the demonstrated performance shows another. And it's trying to get away from explanations, rationalizations, whatever. We're just describing what we see. There are two things here and there's a gap between them. Let's hold that out. Let's explore how we might account for that difference. So we're just taking it slow, holding out our observations. Now, if we think about this particular situation, there's obviously a man looking out a window, but when I was first shown an image like this as a graduate student, I was asked, what do you see there? And I remember my response was, this guy, well, I think he's worried. He's thinking about something. He's got a bit of a frown, maybe he's had a bad experience, things have not gone well, or he's got a difficult meeting coming up. And I was trying to lock in on a conclusion. And I think that's the reacting thing. We're socialized to try and explain situations we come across. Instead of saying, well, look, there's a man here, perhaps he's in his 40s, he's dressed in a jacket and tie, his hair is kind of slightly brushed back, his brow is a little furrowed, his mouth is closed. He appears to be gazing out a window. There are Venetian blinds. You can see the reflection of a building in the background. So it's trying to evoke a rich description of what we see, as if you were describing a painting in a gallery, so that we can then hang interpretations off that, but separating the observations from the interpretations. So, I notice his brow appears to be a little sort of drawn. That makes me wonder if he's contemplating an issue. Perhaps he's reflecting on the day, or perhaps he's got something coming up that he's a little concerned about. So it's kind of trying to present your data and then the interpretations distinctly from that, allowing that there could be different interpretations. So we're not locking into one. We're inviting feedback. So it's kind of, what do you see when you look at this? Tell me, is what you see different from what I see? This is the practice of working from observation. Now, let me just check in. How are we going with those questions? Anything turning up yet? No questions as yet. So I'm inviting you folks to, my assumption is here that we're going to make this interactive. So I'm hoping
we only have Don,
I'm
can
sorry?
you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We only have one question, but that's about avoiding judgment.
Let's
and
go with that.
that's going to be next, so we can.
Yeah, let's just take that question now, because we talked about judging as a reaction. So I think that's okay. Would you share that question, please?
Yeah, the question is about what are the tactics you can use to avoid judgment, but I know you'll cover that later as well.
Oh, okay, so yeah, we will hold that one because that comes up in the next leg of the tripod, so we will go to that one shortly.
So
okay,
in terms of picture here, there was a comment, maybe he's just watching the window cleaner, the guy that you had in the picture there.
Okay, so there's a window cleaner. There you go. That's something I hadn't.
Not an observable.
Yeah, well, maybe there's a window cleaner outside. So there's any number of possibilities. That's right. So it's kind of allowing that we have one way of seeing. It's not the only way of seeing. It's not an objective way of seeing. What we observe is always a subjective construction based on our past experience, our life story, where we stand, our expertise and so forth. We're partial observers of the world. yet we tend to objectify what we see, and that's an illusion, and it's a mistake, and it compromises the quality of conversation. So regarding your objectives as your observations as one way of seeing is a really important first step in creating productive conversations, whether it's for quality or for anything else. Okay, so I'm sorry, Sadita. Was there another question?
We had another comment.
Yep.
It's more kind of a comment. So Carlos is saying, wouldn't the concept of reacting to the person's expression introduce prejudice itself?
Yes, it does. Exactly. That's a very good point. It does. So we will tend to react based on our biases, and those flow through into, our biases flow through into our reactions. So the more we react, the more biased our position is likely to be, and we're not likely to be conscious of our biases either. So that's the reflective element. The more we can just sit and notice things, we might just become a little more aware of the lens, the bias that we're bringing. So that's a great point. Now, another idea about working from observation is the idea that we need to take a higher view. Ronald Heifetz from Harvard has talked for years about taking a balcony view, stepping up on a balcony. I give this a bit of a contemporary twist by thinking about what's on a drone's camera, what might be observable from a drone or a swarm of drones hovering over any situation. And that introduces the idea that the drone actually might notice us as participants in the conversation, and perhaps some of our own behaviours. Maybe we're leaning into the conversation in a slightly exaggerated way, or perhaps we're withdrawing. So it's trying to imagine what a drone might see about the whole situation, including the dynamics, who's talking to whom, what's not getting talked about, who's at the table, all these kinds of things, observing the patterns and dynamics as well as the detail, taking the large view and the particular view. Now, here's a scenario or a bit of a situation. I'll read this out for anybody who might be listening to this without screen access. So Angela's situation. Angela works in a surgical practice, and she says, today in a regular practice meeting, I was presenting performance data on things like operating room utilisation and cancellation rates. The meeting had been dragging on. By the time we got to my report, we were way behind schedule. At one point, one of the surgeons, Matthias, interjected and said loudly, "That's complete rubbish," then walked out of the room. I was flabbergasted, and then later felt really upset and belittled. I need to talk to Matthias, but what to say? Okay, so let's think about what's potentially observable in Angela's situation. And we've got a couple of pairs here. So if we look at pair one, which of those is observable? Maybe you can just text in your responses. Do you think it's option A or option B? Let's just invite people to text in, and perhaps, Sadita, you can tell us what's coming through. Is it option A or option B people are preferring?
Option A in terms of number one first, or?
So we'll go with question one, which has two options, A and B. So just dealing with the left box on the slide. So it's option A, the meeting had been dragging on, or option B, the meeting was half an hour behind schedule. Which of those two is observable?
So just respond on number one, please, if you can. Yes. So for number one, I see more B.
Yeah, B
so
it is.
Observable. That's
yeah, that's the correct answer, because it's what we're doing in B is giving description. There's data there. There's less of an evaluation. Dragging on is a subjective interpretation that comes from someone's perspective. The meeting's not going fast enough or whatever. So working from observation, we're trying to describe, we're trying to share our data. And then, after that, you could say, well, and I thought it was dragging on, but it's giving the data first. Let's try option B. Which one do we get there? So, sorry, option 2, is it A or B? Text that in if you can. What are we hearing there, Sudhita?
We see more of A, Don.
We're seeing more of A. So A again is correct, and A is the more descriptive of the two. Maybe the surgeon was angry, but maybe the surgeon was, frustrated by something going on outside the meeting, or kind of worried about a delay in getting to a patient, or frustrated about something not having happened when he expected. So it's angry is one possible interpretation. But if you said, Matthias, I think you were angry then. And if he thought he wasn't angry, he might be a bit upset with that. Whereas to say, look, Matthias, your voice seemed a bit raised then, that's less likely to provoke a defensive response. So we're not trying to sanitize the conversation or sort of sweep away important data, but we're trying to describe situations in ways that they'll be heard. So the option A is probably the better way to go there. Let's move on. So attributing reasonableness, and this comes to the idea of how we avoid judgment. So we might find ourselves judging people. The idea is not to suppress that, but to recognize that's a thought in our heads, but then mindfully to kind of park it, move that thought to one side, and then just enter into this more imaginative space where we contemplate what might it look like to this stakeholder, allowing they can be reasonable right now. Now, again, it's not about judging whether they're reasonable or not. It's about allowing that it makes sense to them. So it's about pivoting, swinging around, seeing it from their side. It's never about judging. And what we're trying to do is to develop different interpretations, possibly multiple interpretations that we can put to the stakeholder and explore and test. It might be that you have a couple of ideas about what is going on for them, but you're really striking a bit of a blank. So you might say, like, I wonder if it's about this or that, but I'm not really sure. Can you tell me more? What does this look like for you? What's your take on this? Or you might be confident you've got an interpretation that, for example, it's an issue about becoming competent in a particular practice, and you might think they're worried they haven't had enough access to training. So you might test that, because that's consistent with reasonableness. Whereas if your default was they're lazy and they don't want to learn, is that consistent with reasonableness? No, that's a judgment. So the whole point of it is, if it's a judgment, a negative judgment, it's untestable. Because if you were to say, look, I think you're lazy and you don't want to learn, clearly there's going to be some kind of explosion. The conversation's not going to go anywhere. Our whole purpose is to open up conversation. So if you say, look, I'm interested in hearing more about your experience in trying to get on top of this skill. Please tell me what's going on for you here. I'm wondering if kind of access to training is an issue. Perhaps there are other things. Tell me what this is about. You're potentially opening up the prospect of interaction rather than shutting it down, which is the judgment thing. So we'll just introduce the notion here that we're taking a dive below the waterline of a proverbial iceberg. So if you think about, I find the iceberg a useful metaphor in thinking about change or improvement, in pretty much any context. So with observation, we're above the waterline. We're looking at what's directly discernible, what's visible. With the reasonableness, the second leg of the tripod, we're diving below the waterline. We're trying to get a sense of what's implicit, what's real for others that they're not sharing, not talking about. And there's a bit of a structure here we might use just as prompts. What might be their hidden assumptions? What might be their interests, like, what's important to them potentially in this context? What might be their hidden or unspoken feelings? What emotional settings might be true for them right now? And what knowledge or experience might they have that's relevant to this issue that they're not bringing to the table? Now, you don't need to kind of necessarily go to each of these questions. We're really trying to get a sense of their story, but these provide a bit of a light structure that you can use for exploring other perspectives. So let's try out the reasonableness piece with Angela's situation. She's thinking about what might be real for Matthias, and one of the following is not consistent with the idea of Matthias as reasonable. Let's think about which one this is. So A is, and what I'd like you to do is text in which one you think is the response that's not consistent with Matthias as reasonable. So A, he was frustrated at the meeting going on, and Angela was on the receiving end of his expression of that. B, he thought the information Angela provided was wrong, and in the spirit of open debate, he thought it was okay to describe it as complete rubbish. C, he doesn't care how others react to what he says. And D, it was a momentary reaction reflecting other pressures Matthias is under and not intended to be personal. Now, one of these is arguably less consistent with Matthias as reasonable than the others. Which one do you think it is? A, B, C, or D? Let's get a sense of, from our organisers, what's coming through.
C and D, mostly.
C and D, yeah, okay. Well, it's actually, I think, C, because D, that it was a momentary reaction. Well, yeah, people do have momentary reaction. There are other pressures. So when he said it was complete rubbish, it was about the issue or the data. It was a kind of, momentary frustration. It wasn't intended as, a personalised attack or judgment about Angela. Whereas C, he doesn't care how others react. That sort of suggests that Matthias lacks empathy completely, doesn't have any regard for the contribution of other people. I think most people wouldn't frame their own responses in that manner. And to say to somebody, look, I think the issue is you just don't care about other people and how they react to what you say, I suspect that's likely to spark a particularly defensive response, and more so than the others. It's probably less testable than the other three. So the criterion to think about when you're attributing reasonableness to others is this an interpretation that I could feed into the conversation? Because that's the whole point of it, to help frame a constructive conversation.
There was a question, actually, Don, that I feel might fit in here. So in this situation, it's like about being reasonable, right? We are assuming that the other person is reasonable. So that's kind of an assumption. As you mentioned, it doesn't matter if they are or not. And the question here was, how do you handle if you notice that, so basically you are aware that the other person is reacting from their own assumptions, even if they are wrong assumptions?
Well,
you mentioned before openness, like open the conversation versus just trying to tell them and make them aware.
So if you believe they're working from their assumptions, well, at least they have a kind of mental processing of this issue that seems sensible to them. So the challenge is to go back to the data. What is the observable data that leads you to conclude that they're working from certain assumptions? So they might have said a couple of things. So you go back to the data and say, I heard you say X. I'm wondering, is there an assumption behind that? Or can you tell me what's in your thinking that leads you to say X? So we're allowing that they're reasonable, that they've got a mental construction of this. We're just not clear what it is, or we might have a set. Or you can say, if you think the assumption is one that somebody, the other person could reasonably make, even though you might disagree with it, you could say, look, I heard you say X, and I wonder if there's an assumption you're making which is such and such. And as long as it's an assumption that someone could reasonably make, it's okay. But if it's an assumption that's not going to be consistent with what a person acting reasonably could come up with, then you potentially got trouble. So I hope that
this is Brooks.
Brooks. Yep.
This is extremely well chosen because a lot of people, there's a stereotype on television of surgeons who don't care what people think, that are very arrogant. And so a lot of people, that's going to be a common answer, even though it's not reasonable.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bias built into the culture.
Exactly. So we're dealing with all manner of cultural biases and our particular sort of take on those cultural biases. So the whole idea of responding mindfully, you know, the notion of slowing down, looking at it from other perspectives, tapping in what's true to us, it's really trying to cleanse ourselves in that moment as much as we can of whatever biases we might be unconsciously bringing into the situation. Now, there's still going to be biases there, probably. There's still a subjectivity, but we're trying to become a little more dispassionate, a little more objective, a little more or a little less biased. And it's a work in progress. It's not a one-off. This is not like some quality tools, you know, kind of a template you can just fill in. You've got to do hard work to actually apply this, and you can apply it once. You know, it might or might not work so well, but it's a work in progress. You then need to have another go, try it out at first in sort of low risk situations, but keep up the practice. That's the spirit of it. Now I'll move on unless we've got any other. Can I just check in? Have we got any other questions or comments at this point?
Not really, but I was curious. So when you say so it is okay to express how that makes you feel. It is okay to ask if there is an assumption that the other person is acting from, but it feels like you shouldn't even touch the part where you are letting them know how it looks like from outside. Is that an inferring on what they're thinking?
Well, the thing is, when you sometimes people don't share all that much. And so you're left with thinking, what's going on for this person? So the idea is you can develop interpretations that you can test, but you can never know until you check them out, whether your interpretations are solid or not. So you can say something like, you know, I wonder if this is an issue about, you know, the amount of training you've had access to. Perhaps there are other things, you know, can you tell me how important that is? Or perhaps other things are more important. If so, tell me what they are. So you need to be careful that you don't project your interpretation as being the only interpretation or necessarily a correct one, because you can't know, but it can be a conversation starter. I'm wondering if it's about X, you know, especially if prior experience or observations has led you to think that this can be a factor in this kind of situation. So, but just be careful that it doesn't involve a negative judgment.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So let's press on. So we're going to the third leg of the tripod, speaking with authenticity, taking that deep personal dive, thinking about what's coming up for us here, and with that, the kind of, remember the slide with the 4, as it were, eggs under the iceberg, thinking about your own assumptions. What am I assuming here? What are my interests? What really matters to me? What am I feeling? What experience, knowledge have I got that's relevant in this situation? And how can I express some of this in a way that's consistent with allowing that others are reasonable and makes connections with observation? So authenticity, you know, in a particular moment, in a raw form, might be, you know, just dumping on the other person. You know, I think you're a complete, you know, X, Y, Z, and I'm going to tell you so. But to do so would breach the judgment leg and the observation leg, so the tripod falls over. So it's a truth, a personal truth that's conditional on maintaining the integrity of the other 2 legs. So all 3 are in place together. That's the core idea, and it's not going to be a full truth. It's going to be, you know, what's relevant now that you're able to say, that's kind of leaning in, getting closer to some sort of truth that you feel consistent with that others are reasonable, and there's some data here as well. So it's that notion of a personal deep dive. We've got the penguins, you know, diving below the waterline of the ice. That's really what we have to do. It's the mindful thing again, slowing down, you know, taking that inner dive and then seeing what comes up for us. So let's apply the authenticity piece with Angela's situation. And we've got 3 options here, and my proposition is that one of them is more consistent with authenticity, at least as it's framed in the OBREAU construction. So in the first one, the way you spoke to me in that meeting was completely inappropriate and unacceptable. I was upset by your yelling at me. I don't like being spoken to like that. Please don't do it again. If you do, I'll need to lodge a formal complaint. So that's Angela's possible first response to Matthias. The second one, what happened in that meeting earlier was not in keeping with our workplace values. If you want people to cooperate with you, you need to treat them respectfully. That goes for me too. Please keep that in mind in future. And then the third one, when I was speaking today in the meeting, you interrupted and said, that's complete rubbish. I appreciate that you might have disagreed with my findings. However, I was taken aback and felt put down. Please don't speak like that to me again. Okay, so one of those is more consistent with authenticity, a la the OBREAU model. Text in your response. Do you think it is A, B, or C? Let's see what comes up.
So depends if we're talking about internal authenticity or the one that we're expressing. I'm joking.
The one that we're expressing.
Expressing, I know.
Expressing, yep.
Yeah.
Indeed. So it's the conversation.
We have a mix of B and C.
A mixture of B and C, okay.
But
so
mostly C?
Mostly C, yeah, well, C is the correct answer, so people are kind of getting this, and that's terrific. So let's just briefly review each of the options. The first one starts off essentially, with an analysis, kind of a conclusion that the way you spoke was inappropriate and unacceptable. There's no data provided. It's just kind of a bit of a full stop. I was upset by your yelling at me. Again, the term yelling is potentially a bit provocative. You could argue that one. And then the business about lodging a formal complaint, well, maybe or maybe not, that might be a little over the top. So the first one is likely to be a bit confrontational and possibly to attract an adverse reaction and not much conversation and mutual learning. The second one, by contrast, maybe is a little indirect, maybe is a little more dancing around. The reference to workplace values, well, and how people are likely to cooperate. Well, that's all well and good, but the reference to Angela is indirect. It's kind of, that goes to, for me too, it's kind of, by the way. So, whereas with the third one, it starts off with some descriptive, there's some more data. I was speaking in the meeting and you interrupted and said it was complete rubbish. And that's kind of what Angela saw as happening. She then allows that Matthias, might have disagreed with the findings. Perhaps there was a bit more, but at least there's a nod, there's an acknowledgement in his direction that he was, acting reasonably as he saw it. But then she's coming back to the authentic piece about her experience of that. I was taken aback, I felt put down. So the important thing is she's using I language. She's not projecting this onto Matthias. She's talking about her experience, and then she's making a request. Please don't speak to me like that again. And often with the authenticity piece, that's a good place to end up, with a request. What is it you actually want here? What do you want to happen? What are you asking for? And so that implies the importance of speaking to your purpose. What is it you want to convey here? Well, for Angela, maybe it's making sure that doesn't happen again with Matthias, letting him know about what happened in my experience, ensuring it doesn't happen again, but maybe, not jeopardizing the relationship, allowing that can kind of maybe move to a better place. Whereas I don't know that she'd be so successful with those intentions with the first two options. So
Don,
yeah,
can we go back a little bit to that slide?
Let's go back.
So in the authenticity part, the I talk, which rationally does concentrate the attention to what am I feeling, how I feel about what happened, and very objective situation. Does that become like I care about how I feel, how you make me feel, without touching maybe what the other person might have gone through, or that word appreciation there used to soften up, and so that the person doesn't feel judged because you're just talking about yourself in that moment?
Yeah, that's a good point, Sunita. Look, this is a kind of truncated example. Ideally, you would have a little more consideration of the other person's situation. It depends on the situation and your purpose. If you just want to convey, look, I don't want this to happen again, then you might be having less keen for input from them. In other situations, you might be saying, well, here's what I noticed, and I'd like to get your take on that and hear about what was going on for you, what was important. I wonder if it was so-and-so, let's talk about that. And then for me, something that mattered was X, Y, and Z, and what I'd ask is so-and-so. So you can kind of open it up, and the reasonableness thing implies that you do spend some time in their corner, as it were. It's not just all about you. I think that's a really good point, but it's contextual as well. At the minimum, you have some regard to their situation and what was going on for them, rather than just it all being about you, as you say. So let's just check, are there any other questions or comments, particularly about the authenticity piece?
This one, only the word appreciation, is it the correct word? That was the question from Manuel.
Yeah, okay, that is a fair question, and I'm not going to argue the case for the word appreciation. I think there's a distinction I want to make here, and I'm glad Emmanuel has kind of pulled this one in. There's a distinction between this approach and what's known as appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry is a well-known methodology in social sciences and organizational development, which emphasizes the positive and building on what's good. And the approach here is different. This is not about being overtly positive. It's about being present, being mindful. And the appreciative inquiry thing is often based on or it tends to be based on the assumption that if we're not positive, then we're negative. We're getting into problems and endless loops of analysis, and we're not going anywhere, and it gets stuck and bogged down. But a mindful approach, what I would call mindful organizational development, actually is not based on getting into problems so much as just data and evidence and noticing and inquiring about different perspectives on that and allowing people to share what matters to them. So the appreciation thing, it's just kind of, my take on that is we're just recognizing that there is another way of seeing that this person have, and we're appreciating that in the sense of just hearing it, learning about it. We might not agree with it. We don't have to agree with it, but just having a sense of what it is kind of useful. So are there any more questions now, or shall we move on and then we can take some general questions?
Yeah, we can move on.
Yeah, okay. So what I want to suggest to you is that the OBREAU Tripod is a multi-purpose tool. You can use it in all sorts of contexts. My proposition is that, if quality has got a lot to do with change in contemporary, fast-moving, dynamic environments, then change implies multiple perspectives, different attitudes, the prospect of resistance, some people being more for it than others. And that signals to me the need for conversation, and conversations which bring out different perspectives and allow some sort of shared meaning to take shape, rather than the old kind of heroic leader at the top with a vision trying to sell it to other people. Now, there are a whole bunch of arenas in which we could apply this. Let me just very quickly pick out a couple of them. The performance one, so there's as I said before, there's an expected performance that's potentially documented. There's an observable performance, and that, there's potentially some data around that. So it's kind of using those data. Well, the agreement says X and what's happening is Y. There is a difference between those two. Let's kind of think about what that might look like from the unit or work group or individual, involved in that performance thing. What's their take on this? The reasonableness thing. What's their narrative? The story they're telling themselves about that. And then what's true for us? What do we need to bring out there? It could be the same around innovation and improvement. Recently, I was talking with someone who was having difficulty trying to get some partners engaged in a continuous improvement initiative, and thinking, why aren't they doing this? Well, they've got a different story. It's not a priority for them. They're caught up with other things. Unless we understand the story they're telling themselves, you know, we're going to be potentially a bit stuck. So, you know, there's a gap between what we want to do and kind of what's actually happening, what's real for other people. Let's explore that. Let's interrogate that. The values, culture, values, and behaviour one. You know, there's all sorts of behaviours going on. In Australia, we've had recently several reports, investigations, media reports, government inquiries about all sorts of problematic workplace cultures, most prominently recently in financial services and banking. And lots of behaviours going on, like, you know, selling people lines of credit that they could never possibly repay. There was even an instance of charging people the accounts of people who died for services that were, you know, not obviously delivered. So it's kind of what's going, you know, what are the observable behaviours here? What does the banks or the organisations, you know, statement of values say should be happening? How can we understand what might be going on that gives rise to this behaviour by allowing that it makes sense to those involved? They have a rationale. Let's interrogate that. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned is that, well, we've talked about this as mainly in the sense of individuals having conversations with other individuals or groups about tricky quality issues. But you can also apply the tripod as a tool to support dialogue. You know, for example, in a school, getting a bunch of parents, teachers, community members together to talk about the degree to which the school is responding to community needs, or the degree to which the school's pedagogy reflects, you know, contemporary approaches. And you can generate observations about that, you know, by having a bunch of participants write observables on sticky notes and put them on a wall. And then you can contemplate the perspectives of different stakeholders, you know, so in a small group context, mixed groups looking at what it might look like from a parent perspective, a teacher perspective, a regulatory authority perspective. So you can do this in a group context as well, and then you can kind of go around the group and you can ask, well, what questions are coming up? What do people really want to share? You know, maybe you've got a few sessions on this, or perhaps a half day. But so the tripod is a tool to support dialogue around quality issues, around any kinds of issues. It's a tool you can wheel in just about in any situation where quality and change are issues. Just to wrap up with some tips for keeping the tripod standing: fine-grained descriptive language, helping you stay with observation. Reasonableness, you challenge, get out of your head and into theirs, try and see it from their side. Authenticity, it's not all or nothing, try and lean into it, keep practicing, keep preparing. Now, just to wrap up my bit before we throw it open for some more questions, Richard Van Dole and I are really keen to establish a community of practice around applying the tripod. We'd hope that ASQ might be kind of interested, and the HD&L division might be interested in this work as well. We'll see where that goes. But I'd invite you, if you're interested in being part of this, you know, the possibility that we put on further sessions for people interested. We support one another online in different ways. If you're interested in that, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or email me. My email is on the last slide, ddanoon@newfutures.com.au, ddun@newfutures.com.au. So reach out if you'd like to do that. But let's just take it out with some more questions. Sudhita, have we got some questions and comments?
we have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to actually cover them. So we have one question is about when you're dealing with people you already know, which you are comfortable, and the conversation just goes, you don't strictly follow the 3 legs of a tripod. And if that conversation is not going well, is it possible to use a tripod halfway? And if so, what would you advise and how to apply that?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of different ways of going with that. Some people find it helpful to actually, and there is a worksheet available, and I'll make that available via HD&L to anyone who wants to kind of get hold of it. So you can sit down with a worksheet and you can kind of make it transparent and say, hey, I've come across this tool, let's see if we can open this up a bit and think about some observables. So you could sit down and actually do it with the other person, or you can just, in your mind, come back to the observable data and say, look, we're good colleagues, we get on well, but I'd like to unpack this a bit more. I've noticed a couple of things here, so you can sort of swing into the observables. You could informally kind of bring this in, but it requires a level of skill and practice to do that. So maybe that's after you've done it a few times. But when you get skilled, this is a tool you can invoke mentally in your head, and just keep kind of applying it in any situation. It doesn't even have to be a work situation. It might be an out of work one. Now I can confess it's hard to do it in the loaded environment of a personal relationships or a family kind of context. With my son, who's a kind of teenager, that tests me. I can easily react, but in less loaded situations, probably those are the extreme situations. So this is it's a kind of mid-range tool.
Another situation, we've had other webinars talking about giving feedback, and one of the things that hit me was you have to basically make sure that the person is willing to talk about it in that moment. Because another question we have here by Lori is like, how do you have any examples where you're basically encouraging other people to share the perspective and be comfortable with it? And one of these situations was really about having that person asked, do you feel comfortable in having some sort of feedback back and forth in that moment, if not give them some time to when they are ready?
Yeah. I think it's always good to be clear about your intentions and as transparent as you can be about those. So, I wonder if this is an opportunity where we could give each other some constructive feedback. How do you feel about that? If you're okay about that, perhaps you could share a few things with me. So, prefacing the conversation with some notion about your purpose, some notion about what you'd like to get out of it, some questions about what they'd like to get out of it, respectfully allowing that, whether finding out whether this is a good moment or you make a time to do it later. There are a few considerations like that. The tripod is really, it's primarily a tool for preparing for a conversation. It's not going to step you through every element of how do you set up a conversation and greet somebody and so forth, but there are there's other guidance out there in the literature about how to do that. But just having regard to where other people are at, your intentions, what seems sensible in the moment, and trusting your gut with the 3 legs that you can get there.
Would you say you'd use? Yeah, go ahead, Brooks.
Yeah, this is Brooks. I'm a little concerned because I haven't had time to figure out whether this is proper communication. But I thought this was a really excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Very valuable, very well thought out, and very usable.
Thank you, Brooks.
I hope I haven't violated too many rules.
You've been terrific, Brooks. I've really appreciated people stepping in, asking questions, and it's been a great honour and privilege for me to present with HD&L, and I encourage people to apply the tripod. I'll make available resources through HD&L to support you in that, and I wish you all the very best with your practice.
Thanks, Don. So I would like, yeah, if you have that handout, we'll send it out. And if you have the 2 names of the authors you mentioned at the beginning, maybe I can email them back to the audience. I wanted to thank you again. And I want also to remind everybody that for credit for tonight's webinar, you'll get that within a day. You'll get a specific email about how to get that credit, as Karen mentioned. And today's presentation and recording of the webinar will be posted on our website, and we have a YouTube channel within like 2 to 3 days. That will be posted, available there. Our next webinar, actually, I'm going to be speaking. So after hearing so many and webinars and I've been working for FedEx for about 7 years in project management, process improvement, cross-departmental type of work for executive management, operational excellence, I do notice a lot on how much we plan, and we take that time to plan properly, and then when it comes to implementing, either it's a strategy or a project we're working at, there is a lot of failure. So as part of my MBA and other studies in organizational leadership, I've been intrigued by what research is out there, but also what in practice, what are the MBA schools teaching, and why we're still failing. Why do we still need to go through these webinars? I don't know if it's a psychology issue, or what is it, like the structure, how we design business schools and how we become managers. So that's what I'd like to share. The webinar is next July 25th. The registration link is already on our website, so you can just go on the website and register. Some other things that I would like to mention, we do have other webinars coming up, and you can get an automatic email notification if you go on our LinkedIn page, if you follow that page, or if you just go on our website and follow up in the email sign up page. There is a survey which we really appreciate you taking. It's about like 7 questions, so it's less than a minute, but that's how we kind of change the timing of the webinar, what speeches we want to continue having. So it's very important that you do that. You'll have that survey pop up in your window if you're on your computer right after you close the webinar, or you can just receive the email within an hour. It's like a follow-up email. You get that link there. For the credit, as I mentioned, receive another email within a day. And again, thanks you for being here tonight, and have a good night, everybody, and looking forward to having you next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.